All right, Shavuos, good morning. Good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's shir. To thank our annual Talmud Torah sponsor, the Tilsa Mishpacha of Eretz Yisrael, for dedicating all the shiurim and drushos this year as a zechus for Besoros Tavos for Am Yisrael. Our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Sivan, Stephen Terry Zin, in loving memory of Steve's mother, Doris Zin Dvora Bas Rabbi Yisrael Yoel Zichron Lebracha, vacation of our 5th yard site. And our Day of Learning sponsors for today, Alan and Sherry Steinmetz, commemorating the yard site of Alan's mother, Chaya Bas Reb Meir, Zichron Lebracha. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the Neshamos Lav and Aliyah, the families and Nechama, all those who need a refuah shleima to have one, should have one together, Emeretz Hashem, with Kol Cholei Yisrael. Kadosh Baruch Hu, Emeretz Hashem, bring home all of our hostages, B'Shalom and B'Karav. And of course, as we follow the events emerging out of Eretz Yisrael, we hope that the Ribbon Shalom will give our holy and precious soldiers incredible siyata d'shmaya as they execute their holy missions. And Emeretz Hashem should shower His Shmira Yisera upon our brothers and sisters in Eretz Yisrael. And hallelujah, we should be Zochem Eretz Hashem, that this current phase of the war should bring incredible bracha, hatzlacha, simcha, shalom, and safety for Achinu B'nai Yisrael and for all of Am Yisrael. I will say with that, let us begin. So today's daf is Mem Gimel 43. We are picking up Emeretz Hashem at the Mishnah on Mem Beis Amud Beis 42b, the Mishnah. So as we continue a little bit, we see as follows: Ve'elu dvarim shein nishba'in aleim. So remember again, we're still focusing on the topic of Mod B'Mikzos. So these are the areas for which there is no shvuah. Right, so these are the particular areas that if a dispute arises, so a shvuah is not used as a mechanism of resolution. What are these areas? Ha'avadim, if there's a dispute regarding avadim and eved. Hashtaros, documents. Karkaos, land, real estate. Hekdeshos, hekdesh. What's the halacha? Furthermore, so we'll say, so again, if there were to be any type of conflict regarding these particular areas, halacha l'maisa, there would be no din of shvuah. Furthermore, the common denominator in all of these particular areas is also ein bahem tashlumi kefel v'lo tashlumi arba v'chamisha. There is no din of kefel in any of these situations. Remember again, kefel is the halacha is a person steals something, they deny that they stole it, they're caught with the stolen item, they have to pay double. Arba v'chamisha, the 4 and 5 time penalty payment, is halacha l'maisa again in the case of stealing and slaughtering sheep or cattle. This is the additional penalty payment you have to pay. Next, shomer chinam. So we'll say, so again, therefore, this first line over here, avodim, shtaros, karkaos, hekdeshos, ultimately no shvuah, no kefel, no arba v'chamisha in all of those scenarios. Okay, next, shomer chinam, ein lo nishba. So the halacha is, a shomer chinam cannot be made to swear a shvuas mod b'mikzos. No say sachar, a shomer sachar, ein lo mishalim. Ultimately, again, doesn't pay. Again, we're gonna define a lot of these cases in the Gemara Emeretz Hashem. Rabbi Shimon says, "Kachim shechai b'achriyusan nishba'in alein, v'she'ino chai b'achriyusan ein nishba'in alein." So Rabbi said, this is very interesting. Rabbi Shimon comes along and says as follows: when it comes to kachim, remember again, because kachim were excluded, the Tanna Kama holds that when it comes to hagdish, there's no din of shvuah by hagdish. Rabbi Shimon says it depends on the nature, ultimately, of the hekdesh. If it's kachim, for example, if it's karbanos, for which you are responsible for, then halacha l'maaseh you could take a shvuah. If you're not responsible for it, you don't have to take a shvuah. What does that mean, karbanos I'm responsible for, karbanos I'm not responsible for? We'll say it's very interesting. Take a look at Rashi. Rashi says, remember, Rashi on the left-hand side, about 10 lines off at the bottom of Rashi. Kachim shechai b'achri yuson, kigon, amar harei alai ola, v'hefish behema l'nidro, v'efkida l'zeh, nishpa aleh osa shapikada miyadon, we'll get into the rest of that. But again, here's the distinction. There's a difference between saying hare alai and hare zu. Right? Let's say I want to offer a particular animal as a nidava, as a gift offering. If I say hare alai karban, then what's happening over here? I'm taking upon myself responsibility to bring a carbon, which means, let's say I say hare alai and I designate this animal, right? This is my ola. The animal dies. So because I said Hare Alai, the responsibility is upon me, therefore, even if this animal dies, I have an obligation to replace it. As opposed to identifying an animal and saying what? Hare Zu. This is a carbon. What's the halacha if the animal dies in that context? I no longer have any obligation to go ahead and bring anything else, because halacha l'maisa, again, the designation was devolved upon this animal, and this animal only. So Hare Alai versus Hare Zu. But it's also a tremendous Musar Haskell that in general, when you take an obligation upon yourself, Hare Alai, what's the extent of your obligation? What's the obligation? Get it done. Get it done. When you commit yourself to something, right? There's a difference. Sometimes, again, a person can be task-oriented or a person can be personal growth-oriented, right? Even though often those things, those lines seem to blur. What's the chilek between being committed to personal growth versus being committed to a task? So if you're committed to a task, if the task gets done, it doesn't get done, okay, sometimes things get in your way. If it's about your own personal growth, that's Hare Alai. If it's Hare Alai, there are no excuses. If it's Hare Alai, the job has to get done. If it's Hare Alai, no matter what I have to do in order to go ahead and meet this goal, I will do it. Incredible. So therefore, again, Rabbi Shmuel makes this chilek. He says, Kachim, if you're chayv in the achrayis of it, ultimately, again, there's a shvuah. You're not chayv in the achrayis of it, no shvuah. Rabbi Meir says, so another interesting case. And again, obviously, we'll explain all of this in the Gemara. Yesh dvarim shehein kikarka. So this is interesting. He says, I should say, Yesh Dvarim Shehein Bikarka Ve'inon Kikarka. Meir says there are certain things that are in the ground, yet they're not treated like karka. Now, remember, again, I will say the Mishnah is all connected. How did the Mishnah start out? The Mishnah started out by saying, amongst the things for which there is no shvuah, karka, real estate, is one of those things. Right? Just to give you an example of this, right? I say to Reuven, I sold you an acre of land, right? And you owe me $10,000. And Reuven says, you only sold me a half an acre of land, and I owe you $5,000. That's not a mod b'mikzas, right? Otherwise, we're dealing with that. Normally, we would have thought partial admission means or triggers a shvuah. There's no din of shvuah by karka. No din of shvuah by real estate. So now, Rabbi Meir comes along and says, there are certain things that are in the ground, yet they're not considered karka. What's an example of this? Very interesting. So the Gemara says, "Ve'in chachamim modim lo." The Chum disagree with this. Keitzad, Rabbi Meir, what case are you talking about? Very interesting. Eser gifanim tu'unos masarti lecha. Listen to this. I say to Reuven, I gave you 10 laden vines. In other words, vines that are filled with grapes. Vines that are filled with grapes, right? And V'halo Omer Einon Ela Chamish. And Reuven says, no, you only sold me 5. It was me 5. So Rabbi says, so Rabbi Meir Mechayiv Shvuah. Rabbi Meir says, Mo Dibba Mixas. Mo Dibba Mixas, partial admission, and therefore again you're going to be Chayiv Shvuah. The Chum on the other hand say, no, Kol Mechuber Lekarka Harehu Kikarka. The Chum say, what are you talking about? This is a karka case. This is a karka case, right? Because it's a karka case, therefore what? Therefore, no mod mixas. So what the exact point of contention between Rabbi and the Chachamim is, well, the Miras Hashem see in the Gemara in just a little bit. Next, Ein Mishba'in Ela Al Davar Sheba Mida B'Sheba Mishkal B'Sheba Minyam. Further, we're going to say, when you swear about something, you can only be made to swear about something that literally, again, can be measured, right? Can be measured, can be weighed, or can be counted. In other words, what the Mishnah is saying is like this. Halacha l'maisa, in order to trigger a mod b'mikzas, there has to be a defined claim. What's the definition of defined? Something you can weigh, count, or measure. All right, for example, the Gemara says, Keitzad, this is very interesting. Bayis molei masarti lecha, v'kis molei masarti lecha. V'hala omer, eini yodea, ela mashe nechta ata notel. So I'll say, for example, I say, Reuven, I gave you a house filled with produce, okay? Or I gave you a purse filled with coins, right? And now Reuven says, listen, whatever you gave me, I'm giving back to you. So the Gemara says, in that case, the Mishnah says, in that case, what's the halacha? Pater. Ultimately, again, Reuven's pater. What does he mean, Reuven's pater? Reuven's pater from Shuas Mod Mixas. Why? Because Lamai said this is not a defined claim. Saying I gave you a house full of produce, I gave you a bag full of money, that is not a defined claim. Remember, the definition of defined is midah, mishkal, minyan. Weight, measure, number. Saying a pouch full, like a purse full, a house full, that's not enough. On the other hand, listen to this. On the other hand, if I say to Reuven, good. I'm sorry. If on the other hand I say, Reuven, I gave you a house filled with produce, and the house I gave you the produce filled house up until the beam of the ceiling. And Reuven says, no, it only went up to the windowsill. Oh, that's moed b'mitzvos. Why? Because that claim has definition to it, right? That claim, again, has a measure associated with it. Okay, incredible. Let's go back. It says the Gemara. Now, let's remember again, the Mishnah began by saying that the items, namely again, avodim, shtaros, karkaos, hekdeshos. So slaves, documents, karka, real estate, hekdeshos, hekdish, these items are not subject to a variety of halachas. Amongst them, kefel, double payment for a thief. So the Gemara says, Tashlumi kefel minalan. From where do you know that? How do you know these objects are not subject to kefel? So the Gemara says, Ditan Rabbana, we learned, Al kol davar pesha. Suppose that the Gemara is quoting over here the pasuk. Just Al kol davar pesha, Al shor, Al chamor, Al seh, Al salma, Al kol aveda sher yomar ki hu zeh, Ada Elokim Yavod Dvar Shneim, Asher Yashir Elokim Yishalim Shnaim L'Re'ehu. Suppose that the pasuk over is talking about the din of kefel, right? So if I steal an object and ultimately again I'm caught with the object, halacha l'maisa, I have to pay a double payment, right? The penalty payment. So the pasuk goes through a list of examples of items that you steal, right? So it gives you the example just shar, an ox, chamar, donkey, seh, sheep, salma, a garment, va'alkol aveda ashayama, or any lost object. So now watch the Gemara dash into the pasuk. Here we go. Tarabonon. Alkol davar pasha, right? For anything with which you sin, klal. That's a klal. Al shar ve'al chamar ve'al seh ve'al salma. Then it specifies again an ox, a donkey, a sheep, a garment, prat. That's a specific statement. Al kol aveda, then it says a kol aveda again, chazer ve'kalal. So we'll say, what do we have over here? Klal, uprat, uklal. So whenever you have a klal, uprat, uklal, right? A general statement, a specific statement, and then another general statement. Iyatadan elakeina prat. So remember again, in that case, the klal is expansive, the prat is limiting. How does this work? The prat defines the scope of the klal. How so? Mahaprat mefurash davar. Shemetaltal v'gufa mamon. So we'll say in this case over here, the prat. Right? What's the common denominator about the prat? Shar, chamar, seh, salma. What's the common denominator? Davar hametaltal. These are all movable objects. V'gufa mamon, and are inherently valuable. Taltal gufa mamon. Therefore, the prat sheds light on the klal, and therefore again, I will say what is included in the din of kefel. Anything which satisfies these two criteria. And Baba said, this halacha l'maisa. How do you know if you have to pay kefel? If you're involved in an object that number one is movable and number two is inherently valuable. Therefore, the Gemara says, Yatsu avadim shukshu l'karkos. So first, Yatsu karkos shemetaltlin. So number one, straight out, this excludes karka. Why does it exclude karka? Why? Karka is not movable. Next, Yatsu avadim shukshu l'karkos. It excludes avadim because in general we find that an eved is always compared to karka. Next, Yatsu shtaros. Shafa ben shemetaltlin in gufan mamon. It excludes shtaros. Why? Because even though shtaros are movable, a shtar is not inherently valuable. And lastly, excludes hektish. Why? Re'ehu ksiv. Interestingly enough, because the pasuk uses lashon of re'ehu, your fellow. Therefore, halacha l'maisa, we exclude ultimately again hektish because hektish doesn't apply to re'ehu, to my fellow. So we'll say, so that's the first nugget of information over here. Why the din of kefel ultimately again does not apply to all of these items. It is learned out from the klal uprat uklal. The only thing, so we'll say nugget number one for today. The only thing that kefel applies to has to satisfy two criteria. Number one, davar metaltal, movable. Number two, gufa mamon, inherently valuable. Incredible. All right, let's go back there. Says the Gemara, v'lo tashlumi arba v'chamisha. Furthermore, again, there's no 4 or 5 time penalty payments on any of these items as well. To which the Gemara says, my taimo tashlumi arba v'chamisha. I'm sorry, my taimo. What's the reason for this? Well, it's very simple. Tashlumi arba v'chamisha amrachmana v'lo tashlumi shlosha v'arba. Because the Torah said it's a 4 or 5 time penalty payment, not a 3 or 4 time penalty payment. What does that mean? Shabbos says it's very simple. Arba v'chamisha, the model of Arba v'chamisha, the 4 and 5 time penalty payment, is built on the shoulders of kefel. Therefore, once you take out kefel, by definition, you never get to Arba v'chamisha, right? What does 4 or 5 time penalty payment come? Well, what does it become without kefel? What does it become without kefel? 3 or 4 time penalty payment. Well, there is no din of 3 or 4 time penalty payment. Therefore, once you go ahead and essentially you pull out kefel, you pull the rug out from under Arba v'chamisha, and therefore by definition or by extension, it just doesn't apply. Incredible. Shomer chinam ema mishpah. So an unpaid custodian, shomer chinam, will not swear regarding these areas. Again, remember, same list. Avodim, shtaras, karkos, ekdeshos. Minahani mili. From where do we know this? Right? Where is this gleaned from? We'll say top of Mem Gimel, 43a. It's very simple. The Gemara says the Tanah Abanah, because we learned ki yitain ish al re'ehu klal. So remember again, the pasuk the Gemara is talking about over here is the pasuk of Shomer Chinam. Let me just read you the pasuk in its entirety. The pasuk reads like this: Ki yitain ish areehu kesef al kelim lishmar. A person will deposit with his fellow, literally again, kesef, money, kelim, utensils, lishmar, to guard. The gunav mi beis ha'ish. So again, and then it's stolen from the house of the shomer. If they find the thief, once again, the thief has to pay kefel. So here we go, top of Mem Gimel, 43a. Ki yitain ish are'ehu klal. So again, that statement, if a person will give to his fellow, that's a klal. Kesef o kelim, money or utensils, prat, specific statement. Lishmar, to guard, Chazar v'kalal. Klal again, what do we have over here? Klal, uprat, uklal. A general statement, a specific statement, and then another general statement. So once again, I will say we are exegetical experts. So what do I know? How does a klal, uprat, uklal work? Very simple. The prat modifies the klal. So the Gemara says, uklal, uprat, uklal, i'atadon el ke'ein prat. So remember again, the klal itself is modified by the prat. Mahaprat mufurash davra hamataltal v'gufa mamon. It's same thing, same klal prat to klal. Shabbos said, what's unique about the items mentioned over here in the pasuk? Kesef o kelim. Common denominator is davra and taltal. They're movable, and what? Gufa mamon, inherently valuable. Therefore, I will say, what do I see from here? Af kol davra hamataltal v'gufa mamon. So therefore, I will say, what do I see from here? That halacha l'meisa, a shomer chinam, can only be held liable for Shevuos in a case of where he's watching something that is movable and inherently valuable. Yatsu karkos shein metaltalin. Therefore, this excludes karka because karka is not movable. Yatsu avodim, it excludes avodim shehok shelu karkos because ultimately again they're compared to karka. Yatsu shtaris, it excludes shtaris. And ultimately it excludes shtaris. Why? Because even though a shtar is movable, a shtar ultimately again is not inherently valuable. And it excludes hektish. Why? Re'ehu ksiv. Because the pasuk speaks about again something that's happening with your fellow, and hektish is not your fellow, which I will say is such a fascinating idea. Hektish is not your friend. Now listen. Now what does this mean? You know, Rabbi Shmuel Silber, the Rebbe says, Rebbe says that we often translate Yiras Hashem as fear of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So the Rebbe says it can't be that Yiras Hashem is fear, right? Why can't it be fear? So the Rebbe says because when you fear something, what do? You distance yourself from it. The Rebbe gives an example. He says, for example, a person fears fire. So because I fear fire, therefore, by definition, I distance myself from fire. The Rebbe says the whole avodah of a yid is to come close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to come close to the Ribono Shel Olam. So it's supposed to come close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So ultimately, again, so why would there be this distance? So the Rebbe says, you're right. He says, Yiras Hashem does not mean fear of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He says, Yira ultimately is from a lashon, ultimately again of like exaltation. Of putting something on a pedestal. When you put something on a pedestal, so by definition, you want to be as close to it as possible, but you recognize that as close as you get, it's always going to be a little bit above you, right? So in other words, but I'm not distanced because of fear. I'm ultimately distanced because this thing, this entity is so great that no matter how close I get, by definition, I'm never going to be able to throw my arms around it. The Rebbe says this is the pasuk by Matan Torah. What does Kadosh Baruch Hu tell Moshe Rabbeinu? It says, Klal Yisrael, tell Klal Yisrael, v'ishtachavisem me'rachok. You're going to bow, but you're going to bow at a distance. This incredible nature of our relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu is we're always coming closer and always getting closer, but there is always going to be this little bit of a gap between us and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Not a gap that's caused by fear, right? But a gap because the Ribbon Shalom is on this exalted pedestal. And again, I as a mortal, ultimately again can only get so close to that. V'shtachavisem meirachok. I'm going to bow, but I'm going to bow at a distance. And it's just fascinating over here, right? How is Hektish excluded from all of these things? Because I will say when it comes to all of these halachas, the Torah is lashon of re'ehu, your fellow. Do you know who's not your buddy? Do you know who's not your buddy? Know who's not your fellow? HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Hektish, right? Hektish is not my buddy. Right? There's a distance. There's a distance, and that distance is necessary for that proper reverence. It's like you go and you meet the Gadol Hadar, right? Whoever everybody decides the Gadol Hadar, we'll see what the ballot's coming, you know? Right? Imagine you meet someone great. I'll say, it's fascinating. What don't you do with someone great? It's incredible. What don't you do with someone great? You don't throw your arms around them, right? As much as, okay, this is a place where a lot of hugging goes on, right? But Lamaisa, there are people that you're not, this applies to you, not to me. I'm saying, right? I'm saying, like, there are certain people, you're going to meet them, you're not going to hug them. You're not going to hug them. Why? Because there's a certain reverence. There's a certain reverence that's there, and a certain distance that's there. It's fascinating. And this is incredibly important, I will say. Why is it incredibly important? Because the Ribbon Shalom is not my buddy. Because he's not my buddy, therefore you have to be so careful in understanding that you don't understand what HaKadosh Baruch Hu does. A lot of times in life, we go through life, we have tinus on the Ribbon Shalom. He did this, he did that, he did that. Those tinus presuppose that I can and I should understand why HaKadosh Baruch Hu does things. And at the end of the day, that's not the way it works. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is not your Re'ehu. He's not your friend. So of course, is it normal to question? Of course, it's normal and reflexive to question. But right after that question, there has to be that understanding is Re'ehu v'lo hekdish. The Ribbon Shalom is not my friend. He's not my Re'ehu. He's not my buddy. He's not the entity that's on the same level as me that I throw my arms around. Yiras Hashem. And that distance has the condition within ourselves to understand that there are certain things we won't understand because I'm here and HaKadosh Baruch Hu is here. The relationship is beautiful, is passionate, is close, is magnificent. But there is always that little bit of distance, always that little bit of, he's on the pedestal and I'm not. And because of that, there's a whole variety of things as I go through life that I'm not going to understand, but yet I find the strength to accept. Incredible. No say schari mishalim, so Shomer Sachar. Shomer Sachar doesn't pay. So the Gemara says, Minalan, from where do we know this? The Tan Rabbanan. So also we're going to go with our klal product klal again. Minalan, the Tan Rabbanan, ki yitin ish are'ehu klal. Person will give to his fellow. Shevuos say this is the pasuk over here now. Kitin ish areu chamar oshar oseh v'chol behema lishmar umeis o nishpar o nishpa ein ro'eh. So the pasuk by Shomer Sachar. So a person will give to his fellow an object to watch. So the Gemara says klal. That's a general statement. Chamar oshar oseh prat. That's a limiting statement. Again, I give Ruvain to watch again a donkey, a shara. So that's a prat. V'chol behema lishmar. And again, any animal to go ahead and watch. Chazar v'kalal. That's the klal again. So I'll say what's talacha? Klalu pratu klal. So again, adhek tishreu. So again, essentially we'll say it's the same exact klalu pratu klal. Namely what? What's the klalu pratu tell me? Davra hamataltal, movable. The gufa mamon, and inherently valuable. So I'll say, interestingly enough, I just want to point out, I don't know, you don't often see this, that it's the same klalu pratu klal for all of these halachas in the Mishnah. So again, I'm only going to pay kefel. Ultimately, again, if it's a davra metalta v'gufa mamon, only if it's movable and inherently valuable. A shomer chinam is only going to pay if he's watching over something, or I should say he's only going to swear, if he's watching over something that is movable and inherently valuable. A shomer sachar is only going to be chayiv to pay if he's watching over an object that is what? Movable and inherently valuable. So out of the gate, what does that exclude? Avodim, karkos, avodim, karkos, shtaros, and tekteshos. Incredible. Next, the Gemara says, Omer yishtam shein kekarka ve'ein kekarka. So next, so remember again, Rabbi Meir said there are things that are in the ground, but not like karka. So what is that? Now, both said, I remember again, the Chacham disagreed. The Mishnah then said, like, give me an example. What are you talking about over here? So remember again, what was the case? I said, Ruvain, I gave you over 10 laden vines. And Ruvain says, no, you only gave me 5. So Rabbi Meir says, Mod b'mikzas. Chachamim say, no, it's not the Mod b'mikzas. So what's going on over here? So the Gemara says, Michlal, the Rabbi Meir Savar Kol Mechuber L'Karka Einu Kikarka. So I will say what it sounds like over here is Rabbi Meir saying, even something attached to the ground doesn't have the din of karka. To which the Gemara says, okay. So therefore, what it sounds like over here is Rabbi Meir looks at the vines as metaltalin. Okay. The Gemara says, Miflagi betunos, liflagi besrukos. If that's the case, why do you have to set up the case as laden vines? Let it be empty vines. It doesn't make a difference what's on the vines or not. No. This is fascinating. You know, what's the machlokes over here? The machlokes over here is that the grapes on the vine are ready to be harvested. So now what's the machlokes? Here we go. The Rabbi Meir Savar kibtzuras damyon, but Rabbanan Savi lo kibtzuras damyon. So we'll say, what's the machlokes? The machlokes is when you have grapes that are ready to be harvested from the vine, are they considered to be harvested or not? We see this a lot of times in halacha. Something is ready to be removed. Is it considered to be removed or not? Rabbi Meir says yes. So because Rabbi Meir says if you have laden vines that are ready to be harvested, we view those grapes as harvested. And therefore what? This is not a din of karka. What is it a din of? Metaltalin. The Chum, on the other hand, say as long as it is actually attached, even if it's ready to be harvested, it is considered to be attached, and therefore halacha l'maisa again karka. Karka, incredible. So I'll say it happens to me, by the way, that Rambam paskins like Rabbi Meir, that anovim ha'omdim livtzor kibtzuros damyon. When you have grapes that are ready to be harvested, they ultimately are what? Considered to be harvested. And therefore this would be a din of metaltalin, not a din of karka. Incredible. So then the Mishnah ended off with a klal. What's the klal? That for mod b'mikzas, there has to be a claim, a defined claim. What is the definition of a defined claim? Mida, mishkal, minyan. Something that could be weighed, measured, or counted. Okay, so now says the like this. Amar Abaye, lo shana da amar le bayis stam. Aval amrle bayis zeh male yedia ta'anase. Listen to this, what I'll say. So when do we say, what's the example of, let's say, an undefined claim? Undefined claim, say, Ruvain, I gave you a house filled with produce. Okay, because that's undefined. But what Rabbi wants to suggest is, if I say to Ruvain, I gave you this house, and I point this house filled with produce, that's a defined claim. Now, what's Abaye's logic? Abaye's logic is because very simple. Since I'm identifying the house, therefore, what can we do? We can go measure it. That's a defined claim. Amrli Rava says, I don't think so. Because Rabbi, if you are right, Ihachi at the Tani Seifa, Ze Omer Ad Haziz, Ze Omer Ad Chalon Chayiv. Because Rava said like this. Let's look at the Mishnah. Right? The Mishnah gave an example. What's an example of a defined case? I said, Ruvain, I gave you a house filled with produce, and the produce went up until the ceiling beams. And Ruvain says, no, it only went to the windowsill. So Rava says, Abaye, if you are right, then liflog, first wide line, liflog v'lisnei b'didei. Then the Mishnah ultimately, again, doesn't have to go into a new case. Use the same case. When is this? So Abaye is male. Abaye is zeh male chayiv. Abaye, if you are right, the Mishnah should have said your case. Right? When do we say it's undefined? When I say to Ruvain, I gave you a house full of produce. But if I say to Ruvain, I gave you this house filled with produce, that's a defined claim. But yet the Mishnah doesn't say that, which therefore leads Rava to say to Abaye, you are wrong. Second wide line, Ela Amar Rava. We'll say, here's the rule. Li'olam eno chayiv ad she'yitanenu b'davar sheba midah, sheba mishkal, v'sheba minyan. Therefore, Rava rejects Abaye's idea. And Rava says, even if I say, Ruvain, I gave you this house filled with produce, that is not enough of a defined claim. In order to have a defined claim, I have to give an explicit weight, measure, or number, and Ruvain has to come back with a different weight, measure, or number to trigger mod of a mixer. So thank you, I'll say the Rava. We have a brace that supports Rava. Kartva libiyadecha I say to Reuven, I deposited with you a core of wheat. And Reuven says, no, I don't have anything. So we'll say, what is that? What do we call that? What do we call that? What do we call that? Don't make me raise my voice. Right? Kofar bakal, right? Kofar bakal, right? Total negation of the claim. What's talacha kofar bakal? Is pater. Menorah, similarly, menorah gedol yesh li yadecha. Right? I say to Reuven, I deposited with you a large menorah. And Reuven says back to me, Ein lecha biyadi ela menorah kitana. Reuven says, no, you didn't give me a menorah. You didn't give me a big menorah. You gave me a small menorah. What's talacha? Pater. Now, why is Reuven pater in that case? That's also called kind of kofar bakal. Remember again, we saw this before. In order for there to be modim mixas, the hoda'ah, the admission, has to be mimin hataina, has to literally again be a derivative of the original claim. If Reuven admits something different than what I'm claiming, so I'm claiming I deposited a large menorah. Reuven says you deposited a small menorah. That's a different item. That's a different item. No different than saying, Reuven, I deposited with you a Cadillac, and Reuven says, no, you gave me a Toyota. Right? That's not the same claim. Next, Azura Gidol Yesh Li Biyadecha. So Reuven, I deposited with you a large belt. Ein lecha biyadi ela Azura Kitana. No, you only give me a small belt. Once again, different claim. Therefore, pater. Aval Omer Lo. However, if I say to Reuven, Kortvo Yesh Li Biyadecha. Reuven, I gave you a core of wheat. Reuven says, no, you only gave me a lesach, which is a different measure. Oh, that's moed makes us. That's moed makes us chayiv. Or menorah bas eser litrin yesh lebiyadecha. Ein lecha biyadi ela bas chamesh litrin chayiv. Or this is actually interesting. We'll have to define this case. Reuven, I gave you a menorah that was 10 pounds of gold. 10 pounds of gold. Reuven says, no, it was only 8. Oh, that's moed makes us. Klalo shel davar. So we'll say, here is the klal. Li'olameno chayiv ad sheyitanenu b'davar shebamidav shemishkav sheminyan. V'yodelo b'davar shebamidav shemish sheminyan. So we'll say, here is the rule. The rule is, in order to go ahead and make a proper claim, my claim must be something that can be defined. What is the definition of defined? Something that can be weighed, measured, or counted. And therefore, again, the hodah, the admission, must also be in the form of something that could be weighed, measured, or counted. And by the way, there's one more piece over here, which is that the hodah, the admission, must be what we call mimin hataina, must be a derivative of the claim. If the admission is not related to what is being claimed, that's not moed b'mikzas. The admission itself has to be an actual derivative of the claim. Klalo shel davar la'asuyei mai. When we say klalo shel davar, what does that come to include? Lav la'asuyei bayis zeh malei. It must be coming to include a bayis case. Right? That if I go ahead, even if I say to Reuven, I gave you this house filled with produce. And Reuven said, no, it wasn't filled, it was only half full. That is not a proper claim. Why is that not a proper claim? Because the statement of this house is not defined enough. Even though we could go into the house and what? Measure the amount of produce that the house could hold. The claim itself has to be defined either by weight, measure, or number, saying this house is not enough. So therefore, again, the klal is coming to reject Abaye's idea. So I don't understand. Umayshna menorah gedola umenorah kitana. So let's go back for a second. What about the menorah gedola menorah kitana case, right? I go to Reuven, I say, Reuven, I deposited with you a gold menorah that was 10 pounds. Reuven says, no, it was only 8 pounds. So the Brisa said that's moed b'mikzas. But why is that moed b'mikzas? Right? Those are two different menorahs. Right? In other words, you're talking about two different objects. Right? So I'm claiming a 10-pound menorah. Reuven's claiming it's an 8-pound menorah. Those are two different objects. Right? You hear the distinction between that case and let's say again, where I claim a core of wheat. I say, Reuven, I left a core of wheat with you. Reuven says, no, it was a half a core. Okay, we're talking the same language, but a 10-pound menorah and an 8-pound menorah are two different objects. So why is that called moed b'mikzas? To which the Gemara says, Masha tano lo hodelo, umasha hodelo tano. I'm sorry. Masha menorah gidolo umenorah kitana. Masha tano lo hodelo, masha hodelo lo tano. Ihachi bas eser bas chamesh. No, I'm sorry. I said that wrong. The case of big menorah, small menorah, that's a case of pater. Right? That's a case of pater. The Brisa said why? Because again, what I'm claiming is not what's being admitted to, and what's being admitted to is not what's being claimed. Okay, so that makes sense. If that's the case, ihachi Bas Esther Bas Chamesh Nami Mashatana Lo Hodalo Mashahodalo Lo Tano. Should be the same case in the case of weights. In other words, if I claim, so we'll say, right? So in the Brisa, we had a case if I say, Ruvain, I deposited a large menorah with you. Ruvain says, no, it wasn't a large one, it was a small one. What's the halacha? Kofar bakal. He's pater. There's no mode who makes us. Why? Because again, what Ruvain's admitting to is not what I'm claiming, and what I'm claiming is not what he's admitting to. But yet, interestingly enough, I'm sorry, I said this wrong, but interestingly enough, if I claim Ruvain, I deposited a 10-pound menorah with you, and Ruvain says, no, it wasn't 10 pounds, it was 8 pounds. The Brisa says that's mod b'mikzas. Why? Why? It's two different menorahs. So the Gemara says, I'm Rabbi Shmuel Silber, menorah shel chulios askinan. Very interesting. We're dealing with a menorah that's made up of parts. Right? It has parts. In other words, it has like a modular menorah, right? Again, also it has like there's sections. It has sections, and therefore again you could add on and you could take off. I must remember again when we talk about menorah, right? So again, I say menorah, you think Hanukkah, right? So again, or Beis Hamikdash, that's what happens. See, so I'm going to show you. That's what Galus does, right? How could it be that we say menorah and a Yid doesn't automatically think Beis Hamikdash? How do we think Hanukkah? It's simple. It's 2,000 years of Galus. 2,000 years of Galus changes the neural pathways, right? We think differently. We think differently. Long before there was a Hanukkah, there was a Beis Hamikdash. Again, Rahman al-Islam, that's what happens with Galus. So we'll say, so what happens? So we think about a menorah like of the Beis Hamikdash of Hanukkah, but menorah just means a candelabra. So again, therefore the Gemara says we're talking about again a menorah that's a modular or has different pieces that can be attached to it. So therefore, when I say 10 pounds and Ruvain says 8 pounds, we could actually be talking about the same menorah. What it comes down to is how many additional pieces are attached to it. If that's the case, Azura nami nistiv lokmi b'd'laifi. If that's the case, why don't you apply this to the belt case also? And maybe when I claim a big belt and Ruvain only missed to a small belt, it's a modular belt. Modular belt. Sometimes after like a 3-day yontiv, you could definitely use one of these, right? You could add on a couple of pieces to it. So the Gemara says, Ella. No, it's not the kind of belt we're talking about because that's not a normal kind of belt. People don't normally have that kind of belt. So therefore, again, I will say, let's not go with that case. No, here's the difference. We're not talking about a menorah made up of pieces. I will say, but rather you could understand that what happens is over here, a 10-pound menorah can become an 8-pound menorah. How? Over time, the precious metal content wears away, especially again, I will say, before treated metals like we have, metal content could wear away, and therefore over time, ultimately the weight could be diminished. So therefore, when we say a 10-pound menorah versus an 8-pound menorah, we could actually still be talking the same exact language. So I will say, therefore, halacha l'maisa, what comes out from this piece over here is as follows. In order to go ahead and trigger a Shevuos, so first of all, the claim has to be defined. The definition of defined, mida, mishkal, uminyan. Weighed, measured, or counted. Furthermore, again, in order for mod mixas taina to be triggered, the taina, or I should say the hodah, has to be min hataina. Ultimately, again, the response has to mirror, ultimately, again, the claim. If the response is unrelated to the claim, then there is no Shevuah. Incredible. Mishnah. Hamavis chaver lamashkon va'avad hamashkon. Suppose a very interesting case over here. I lend Ruvain $1,000, and Ruvain gives me collateral. What ends up happening over here? I lose the collateral. I lost it. What's the halacha? So we'll say, now you can understand where this is going to go. Now we have a dispute about what the value of the collateral was. So ultimately, I say to Ruvain, look, I lent you a selah, but the collateral was only worth a shekel. So I'm claiming, I'm the lender. I'm claiming that clearly, again, the collateral was not worth the value of the loan. So obviously, I lost the collateral. So obviously, we're going to deduct that value from Ruvain's repayment. But Allah, Ruvain still owes me money. On the other hand, on the other hand, Ruvain says, no, the collateral was worth the full amount of the loan. So you lost collateral. I'm sorry, Silber, you can't collect anything more. So we'll say, what's the halach over here? Pater. Now we'll say, what is this? So interestingly enough, this Mishnah is a kind of like a case of Moed Mixas, as we're going to see, right? So I'm claiming to Ruvain, you still owe me money because the value of the collateral did not match the value of the loan. Ruvain's claiming I owe you nothing because the value of the collateral fully matched the value of the loan, essentially to a certain degree what we call like a kol for bakol, right? He's not admitting to anything. Therefore, Allah Chalamaysa from Shua. Next case. I say to Ruvain, I lent you a seller, and you gave me collateral. I lost the collateral, but the collateral was only worth a shekel. In this case over here, Ruvain says it wasn't worth a shekel, it was worth 3 dinar. Now, listen, I remember again, normally what we say is a seller is equal to 6 dinar. So essentially what Ruvain's agreeing to over here is the collateral was worth half the value of the loan. So shtickle modib makes us over here, to which the Gemara says chayiv. Therefore, Reuven's going to be chayiv in a shvuah, or we'll see who exactly is chayiv in a shvuah in just a moment. Next, selahil visani alav ushtayim hayashava. Right? So we'll say, interestingly enough, so in this case over here, now this is Reuven talking. Reuven says to me, Silber, you lent me a seller. Ultimately, again, the collateral was actually worth twice as much as the loan. That's all Reuven had, was worth twice as much as the loan. I, the lender, say, lo, ki I claim, no. I agree that the collateral was worth as much as the loan, not twice as much. What's the halacha? Potter. There's no din of shvuah over here. Supposed to say these cases are the reverse, because now this is the borrower talking, right? So here again, Reuven says, Silber, you lent me a seller, and the collateral was worth 2 slime. The Gemara says, I say, no. I lent you a seller, and the collateral ultimately again was worth 5 dinars. Therefore, you still owe me 1 dinar. So what's the halacha? Chayiv. In that case, again, there's a din of shvuah. So the Gemara says, "Umin nishpa." Who swears? Who swears in all of these cases? Misha pikadon etzlo. So we'll say the person in possession, or who was in possession of the deposit, is the one who swears. Now, in most cases, who is that going to be? That's going to be the lender. Right? Why? Shema yishpazeh v'yotzi ala sapikadon. What are we concerned about? We're concerned about maybe I really do have the pikadon. What's going to happen? Reuven's going to swear, right? And then I'm going to pull out the pikadon tara and show that again Reuven is really lying or Reuven's mistaken, and that will passel him from being a witness in any future cases. Therefore, Allah Chalamaysa, in order to avoid the possibility of somebody actually being in possession of the pikadon, lying that he doesn't have it, and then taking it out after the other party takes the shvuah, the one who is in possession of the pikadon is the one ultimately who takes the shvuah. Incredible. Amud Beis. Says the Gemara here. What's that last statement? That last statement, I will say, right? The last statement of the Mishnah, which was, whoever is in possession of the pikadon is the one who takes the shvuah. What case is that referring to? Ilema Aseifa, if we're talking about the end of the Mishnah, the Seifa klei, the Shvuah Gabi Malva. So we'll say in that case over here, really, the Shvuah really resides with the Malva, right? Because remember again, it's the Malva, it's the lender who lost the Shvuah, right? And now again, the borrower is claiming that the value of the collateral was actually worth more than the loan itself. Since it is the lender who had the pikadon, the lender who lost it, shouldn't it be the lender ultimately who's taking the shvuah already anyway? Amar Shmuel Aresha. Shmuel says, you're right. We're talking about ultimately the first case of the Mishnah. We'll see exactly what that means in just a moment. The Gemara says, okay, I got it. My Aresha, which case, but again, there's a lot of cases in the Mishnah. Which case in the Mishnah you're referring to? Seifa Deresha. Literally, again, the second case in the first part of the Mishnah. What's the case? Here we go. Sela hilvisicha alav v'shekel hayashava. Ultimately, supposed to say, here we go. Sela hilvisicha alav. Supposed to say, here's the case. I'm the lender. I lent Reuven $1,000. Right? Reuven gave me collateral. He gave me collateral. So now I say to Reuven, I'm sorry, I lost the collateral. I lent you $1,000. Shekel hayashava. So just to keep things easy, I say ultimately again, the collateral was worth $500. So again, I'm agreeing that because I lost the collateral, therefore what? What have I forfeited? $500 of repayment. Okay, so I'm admitting to the fact that the collateral had a value and willing to forego that value. But here's the problem. Reuven says, "Valo omer lo ki alasela visani alav ushlosha dinarin hayashava." Ultimately, again, what's Reuven's claim? Reuven's claim, no, the collateral wasn't worth $500, it was worth $700. So therefore, again, so now Reuven's saying, you lost the collateral, therefore you lost $700. I agree, I'm going to pay you $300, but Lamaisa, that's the value of your claim. So Shava, right, so the Gemara says, what's the halacha? So what's the halacha? Chayiv shvua. So Rabbi say, so what's the halacha? So I'm sorry. Dinar Hayy Shava. Chayiv the shvua gabe loveh. Now both say, so therefore, what's the halacha? Shvua. Now who takes a shvua in this case? Who, right? Just plain this up before we go on. Who should take the shvua in this case? What would you say? What would you say? It's the borrower, right? Because the borrower himself is the one who's trying to exempt himself from payment. So it makes sense, and he's also like a shtickle mode of a mixas, right? Because again, remember, he's admitting, the borrower is admitting that the collateral did not cover the full face value of the loan. So what he's admitting already is, I only owe you 300. The lender is saying, no, you owe me 500. So it's a shtickle mode of a mixas, and therefore, again, it makes sense to say that the borrower should be the one to take the shvua about the value of the collateral. And now watch what happens. So both say that is the halacha. But watch, this is incredible. V'shaklu rabbana milove, v'shajua amalva. Oh, what happened over here? This is incredible. It's incredible. So the rabbis, Chazal, took the shvua away from Reuven, and who did they put, right? They took it away from Reuven, the borrower, and who did they put it on? They put it on me, the lender. Now, why? What were they concerned about? They were concerned about over here that maybe there's some shenanigans happening over here, and maybe I still have the collateral. And what am I going to do? I'm going to wait till Reuven swears. I'm going to pull out the collateral. Ta-da! I have it. Reuven, look, you're a liar. You're a liar, and thereby invalidate Reuven for all future eidos. Disqualify Reuven. Now, again, it's also possible that Reuven is not a liar. Reuven is mistaken. So Chazal didn't want any shenanigans happening over here. So what did they say? We want to make sure that the lender doesn't really have the collateral. So what are we going to do? Even though it's really the borrower who should be swearing, right? Because the borrower is claiming that the collateral is worth 700. Lender is saying the collateral is only worth 500. So really what should happen over here is the lender should swear about the value of the collateral and move on from there. But what Chazal did is they take the shvua from the borrower and they put it on the lender. B'hashta da'amra v'ashi, t'kaim alon, zen nishba she'ena b'shuso, v'zen nishba kama shava. So as in Rav Ashi, interestingly enough, Rav Ashi says, actually, this shvua really morphs, this whole case really morphs into something different. There's really a lot of swearing going on all around over here, right? Because I will say why. The lender has to swear that he does not have the collateral in his possession. He has to make that oath, right? And the borrower has to swear how much the value of the actual collateral is. Shabbos say, so now, it's not a question of who swears. What is it a question of? What is the question of? Who swears first? Mi nishba tchila. Who swears first? Mi shapi kadon etzlo. So I'll say, who swears first? He who is in possession of the collateral. Why? Shema yishba zeh v'yotzi halah sapi kadon. Because what are we concerned about? We're concerned that halacha l'maisa, that maybe the borrower is going to swear, and tada, the lender is going to take out collateral. Now, the Gemara just threw that out at us. We have not seen that before. I mean, we saw it in Baba Metzia, but we have not seen that referenced over here. Then, in fact, in a case like this is fascinating. So, again, in this case over here, I lent Reuven $1,000. Reuven gave me collateral. I lost the collateral. Now, what's the point of contention? The point of contention over here is, what's the value of the collateral? I'm agreeing the collateral is worth $500. I agree. Reuven says, no, it was worth $700. So what happens over here? So now, say, we've been focusing on who swears regarding the collateral. By the Gemara says, I just want to tell you, there's actually two Shevuos happening over here. I have to swear that I don't have the collateral in my possession. I have to swear that I lost it. It was stolen, whatever it is. I have to make that Shua because I am a shomer on the collateral. So I have to swear about the collateral. And then what happens? Then Reuven has to swear ultimately again about ultimately, again, the value of the collateral. So now really what it comes down to, Rabbi say, is both of us are swearing. So the real shaila is not who's swearing. The real shaila is who's swearing first. So it turns out that halacha l'maisa, here's the order. First order of business, first shvua is me, the lender. I swear that what? The pikadon is not in my possession. After that, Reuven swears about the value of the pikadon. And after he takes that shvua, we settle up for the remainder of the outstanding money. So if Reuven is really willing to swear that the pikadon itself is worth $700, he swears about it, then what's the halacha? He takes his shvua, pays me the outstanding $300 and Shalom al Yisrael. Incredible. Amr Shmuel. We'll say, just read another line. So Shmuel says as follows: Hayman da ose alpha zuzah de chavre. So it's an interesting case over here. We'll at least start it, then we'll have to stop. So Reuven says like this: I lend $1,000 to Reuven, and what happens? Umashkin lekata de magla. And what happens over here? I'll just tell you this outside, then we'll stop. So I both say, we get into an interesting question about collateral. When we normally speak about collateral, we assume that collateral has an inherent value. What do we do in a case where the collateral itself seems to be valueless or certainly does not match the value of the loan? Is there the possibility to ascribe a heightened level of value to an otherwise valueless collateral? And Miras Hashem to be continued tomorrow. Bosai, Shkoyach. What a daf, what a day, what a week. Shkoyach, everyone, a good night of Shabbos. All right, Chevron on Zoom. Good Shabbos, everyone. Good Shabbos, good Shabbos. To our brothers in Eretz Yisrael, Miras Hashem, it should be a peaceful Shabbos, a holy Shabbos, a Shabbos of Hashgacha Pratis, Hashgacha for our entire Klal Yisrael, and Besoros Tovos, Yeshuas, Nechamos, and Shalom. Shabbos, Bosai. Good Shabbos.